The dust of the coastal road between Caesarea and Arsuf hung in the air like a shroud on the 1st of September in the year of our Lord 1191, and within that ochre cloud moved an army that had already learned to fear the silence that preceded screaming death. Richard Plantagenet, third of that name to rule England, though he had spent barely 6 months of his 33 years within its rain-soaked shores, rode somewhere in the centre of that serpentine column, his mind occupied not with the green hills of Anjou or the political intricacies of his island kingdom, but with the mathematics of survival in a land where water was worth more than silver and every shadow might conceal a Saracen archer. The Crusader army stretched for nearly 2 miles along the narrow strip between the sea and the forested hills, 12,000 fighting men accompanied by their servants, camp followers, and the ever-present merchants who followed warlike gulls follow fishing boats, and among them walked men who had seen Jerusalem's walls gleaming in the distance, only to watch that vision recede like a mirage when Salah ad-Din, whom the Franks called Saladin, had retaken the holy city 4 years prior. Richard had arrived in the Levant in June of that year after a winter spent conquering Cyprus, that strategic island he had seized from the Byzantine usurper Isaac Komnenos in a campaign lasting mere weeks, demonstrating the brutal efficiency that had earned him his epithet in the endless wars against his father Henry and his brothers in the continental domains of the Plantagenet Empire. The men who marched under his banners came from every corner of Latin Christendom. English knights whose families had held their lands since the conquest, Norman barons whose grandfathers had carved out principalities in southern Italy and Sicily, Angevin soldiers who spoke the langue d'oil and considered themselves more French than the Capetian King Philip Augustus, who had recently abandoned the Crusade, Poitevins and Gascons from Eleanor's ancestral lands, German mercenaries who fought for silver pennies, and the military orders, those Templars and Hospitallers whose white mantles marked with red crosses represented a fusion of monastic discipline and martial prowess that scandalized and fascinated the Muslim commanders who faced them. The march from Acre, which Richard had finally captured after a siege lasting 2 years, had been a masterpiece of military organization, the kind of methodical advance that demonstrated why Richard, despite his legendary impetuosity in personal combat, was perhaps the finest tactical commander of his age. Each morning the army rose before dawn, attended mass if priests were available, consumed whatever rations remained, and formed into a marching order that placed the supply wagons and non-combatants nearest the sea, where Genoese and Pisan galleys paralleled their advance, while the fighting men formed a living wall between these vulnerable elements and the hills where Saladin's 40,000-strong army shadowed their every step. The heat was monstrous, the kind of crushing Mediterranean summer heat that turned male hauberks into ovens and made the quilted gambesons beneath them sodden with sweat, that attracted flies in clouds, and the Crusaders had learned through bitter experience that a man who removed his armour for comfort might find a Turkish arrow in his throat before he could cry out to God. Saladin had not intended to allow this Christian host to march unmolested to Jaffa, that port city which Richard needed to secure as a supply base for any eventual advance on Jerusalem, and for days his light cavalry had harassed the column, darting into loose arrows before retreating beyond the range of crossbow retaliation. The Saracen composite bow, formed from layers of horn, wood and sinew, could be fired effectively from horseback, a skill that Latin knights, trained to fight as heavy cavalry, with lance and sword, found both alien and terrifying. Turkish arrows were smaller than the English cloth-yard shafts that Richard's Welsh archers used, but they were fired in such quantities that they darkened the sky, and the Crusader infantry learned to march with their shields held high, protecting both themselves and the destriers, those expensive war horses that a knight valued above almost everything he owned. A destrier killed by an arrow represented an investment equivalent to 15 oxen, enough wealth to sustain a peasant family for years, and the Crusader army had already lost hundreds of these animals in the running battle that had characterized the march south from Acre. Richard had given explicit orders that no man was to break formation to pursue the Muslim skirmishers, understanding that Saladin was attempting to draw out elements of the Crusader army that could then be isolated and destroyed, but this iron discipline required the soldiers to endure harassment without retaliation, a psychological burden that weighed on them like the physical burden of their armour. On the morning of September 1st, as the column prepared to depart from its camp north of Arsuf, Richard's scouts reported that Saladin had massed his full army in the hills ahead, suggesting that the Sultan intended to force a decisive battle. This was simultaneously what Richard most desired and most feared. Desired because the Crusader army was consuming its supplies with every passing day and could not sustain an indefinite campaign without a major victory that might break Saladin's power. Feared because a catastrophic defeat would not merely end the Crusade, but potentially annihilate the remaining Christian presence in Outremer, the Frankish states that clung to the Levantine coast like barnacles to a ship's hull. The previous night, Richard had consulted with the Grand Masters of the military orders and the barons who commanded contingents of the army, and they had debated whether to seek a defensive position and force Saladin to attack fortified lines, or to continue the march and accept battle on the move. The decision to march reflected Richard's understanding that static defence surrendered initiative to an enemy whose forces were more numerous and who could afford to wait for thirst, disease and desertion to erode Christian strength. The Crusader army formed up in its now familiar marching order. The Templars formed the vanguard, their white mantles and red crosses visible for hundreds of yards, providing both military security and spiritual reassurance to the men behind them. Following the Templars came the Bretons and men of Anjou, then the contingent under King Guy of Lusignan, the disputed king of Jerusalem whose incompetence at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 had led directly to Jerusalem's fall, but who maintained his claim to a throne that now existed more in theory than reality. The centre of the column contained the Norman and English troops under Richard's direct command, along with the invaluable baggage train. Behind them marched the forces of Champagne and Burgundy, French nobles whose contingents had remained in the east even after Philip Augustus had departed, and finally the Hospitallers formed the rear guard, their black mantles with white crosses serving as a stern warning to any Saracen raiders who thought the tail of the column might be vulnerable. Between these infantry blocks rode squadrons of mounted knights, perhaps 2,000 heavy cavalry distributed through the column, men whose families had mortgaged estates, sold ancestral lands, or borrowed at usurious rates from Jewish moneylenders to finance their journey to the Holy Land, each one representing a concentration of wealth and military training that made them the medieval equivalent of modern tanks. As the sun climbed higher, transforming the coastal plain into a furnace, Saladin's army descended from the hills in formations that to Frankish eyes appeared chaotic, but which actually demonstrated sophisticated tactical coordination. The Saracen forces were organised around ethnic and regional lines. Mamluks, those slave soldiers who formed the elite core of many Muslim armies, trained from childhood in martial arts and bound by ties of loyalty to their commanders that transcended normal feudal obligations. Syrian Arabs who fought for faith and the promise of plunder, Kurdish cavalry from Saladin's own Ayyubid family's highlands, Bedouin irregulars whose knowledge of desert warfare made them invaluable scouts and skirmishers, and contingents from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even distant lands beyond the Oxus River, drawn by the call to jihad against the Frankish invaders. The initial attacks came from the Saracen right wing, aimed at the Hospitaller rearguard, thousands of mounted archers sweeping in to loose arrows before wheeling away, a tactic the Turks called the caracol, designed to inflict cumulative damage while avoiding decisive engagement. The Hospitallers, commanded by their Grand Master Garnier of Nablus, closed ranks and continued marching, their shields locked to form a moving wall, but the arrow storm was unlike anything the Crusaders had yet experienced on this march. A chronicler who survived the battle would later write that the arrows fell so thickly that you could not fit your hand between them where they struck the ground, and while this was surely hyperbole, the intensity of the archery was sufficient to drop dozens of horses and force the Hospitallers to slow their pace. Richard, informed of the pressure on his rear guard, sent orders that the Hospitallers were to maintain position and continue marching, that no unit was to charge without his explicit command, but he also dispatched squadrons of crossbowmen to reinforce the rear, understanding that morale would collapse if men believed they were being sacrificed while their commanders did nothing. The crossbow, that mechanically powerful but slow-firing weapon that the Church had condemned as too murderous for use against Christians but permitted against infidels, had a range and penetrating power that exceeded the composite bow, and the Genoese crossbowmen in Richard's army were professionals who had trained with their weapons since childhood. These mercenaries moved with practiced efficiency to support the Hospitallers, forming firing lines that would loose coordinated volleys before falling back behind the infantry to reload, a process that required placing the bow against the ground, fitting one's foot into a stirrup at the weapon's end, and hauling back the string with either a hook attached to one's belt or a mechanical spanning device. While the crossbowmen worked, Saladin expanded his attack along the entire length of the Crusader column, transforming what had been harassment into a full-scale assault. Muslim drummers beat a rhythm that Frankish chroniclers compared to thunder, while horns and cymbals created a cacophony intended to terrify Christian horses and demoralize Christian soldiers. Psychological warfare combined with the physical threat of thousands of arrows arcing through the crystalline Mediterranean air. The coastal road, never more than a few hundred yards wide at this point, became a killing ground where men and horses fell in growing numbers, and the pristine sand that had gleamed white in the morning sun began to darken with spreading pools of blood that turned black as they soaked into the earth. Richard rode ceaselessly up and down the column, his presence serving to stiffen resolve wherever desperation threatened to transform into panic, his distinctive height and the royal banner that followed him making him a target for every Saracen archer within range. But he seemed to bear a charmed life, arrows that should have found him instead striking the men around him, or miraculously deflecting from his armour. The King of England wore a surcoat of scarlet silk over his mail, embroidered with the 3 golden lions that were his heraldic device, a mark of arrogance or courage depending on one's perspective, making himself the most visible man on the battlefield, in an era when commanders who wished to survive often disguised themselves as common soldiers. Near the village of Arsuf, whose name would become forever associated with this day's carnage, the Saracen pressure intensified further as Saladin committed his reserves, apparently convinced that the Crusader line was near breaking point, and that one final surge might shatter Christian cohesion. The Sultan, now in his 54th year and suffering from the accumulated ailments of decades of campaigning, personally supervised the attack from a hilltop position where he could observe the battlefield's full extent, his yellow banner visible to both his own troops and the Crusaders, serving as a focal point for Muslim morale, just as Richard's presence galvanized Christian resistance. Saladin had reunited the fractured Muslim world through a combination of military brilliance, diplomatic skill, and genuine piety that even his Frankish enemies acknowledged, transforming himself from a Kurdish mercenary's son into the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the paramount Muslim leader whose name was invoked in Friday prayers from the Atlas Mountains to the Zagros range. His victory at Hattin had reversed nearly a century of Crusader expansion, but he knew that Richard represented a threat unlike any he had previously faced, a commander whose tactical acumen matched his own, while possessing resources that the fractious Muslim coalition could not match in sustained warfare. The Hospitaller Grand Master, watching his men and horses fall in increasing numbers while forbidden to retaliate, finally sent a desperate message to Richard. Unless the rear guard was permitted to charge and relieve the pressure, it would disintegrate, and with it the entire army's cohesion. Richard's response was to personally ride to the rear, accompanied by a bodyguard of picked knights, and to assess the situation with his own eyes rather than relying on reports filtered through intermediaries. What he saw confirmed Garnier's assessment. The Hospitallers were indeed near their breaking point, with wounded men being trampled by horses maddened with pain, supplies being abandoned to maintain marching speed, and the spaces between ranks growing as casualties mounted and exhaustion overwhelmed discipline. The military mathematics were clear. If the rearguard collapsed, the entire column would be rolled up from behind, each successive unit being destroyed in detail as they tried to face about, while still under attack from the flanks. But if Richard authorized a charge prematurely, before the full army was positioned to support it, the cavalry that charged might find themselves isolated and destroyed, leaving the infantry defenseless. Richard made his decision based on a calculation that combined tactical analysis with psychological insight into his enemy's dispositions. He would authorize the charge, but only after continuing the march just long enough to bring the entire Crusader army adjacent to Arsuf, where a forest to the east would protect his flank and prevent Saladin from enveloping his position, and where the slight elevation would give his knights the advantage of charging downhill into the Saracen formations. He returned to the centre of the column and gave orders that spread along the line through a chain of messengers. When 6 trumpets sounded in rapid succession, first in 3 short blasts, then 3 long ones, the cavalry was to charge, and not before, regardless of circumstances, and every man in the army was to be prepared to support that charge by pressing forward simultaneously to prevent the Saracens from isolating the charging knights. The trumpet signal was crucial because in the din of battle, with thousands of men shouting, horses screaming, and Muslim drums pounding, verbal orders could not propagate along a line stretching 2 miles, but the distinctive pattern of trumpet calls could be heard and recognised even in chaos. The Crusader army continued its agonising advance, each step contested by arrows and the occasional bold rush by Saracen cavalry, who would gallop close enough to hurl javelins before retreating, and in the ranks, men prayed to saints whose intercession might ward off the death that hissed through the air around them. The psychology of medieval combat was shaped by a worldview in which death was not an ending, but a transition, and where dying in battle against infidels carried the promise of immediate entry into paradise, the same promise that motivated their Muslim adversaries, creating a symmetry of conviction that made both sides willing to endure casualties that would break modern armies. Shortly after midday, when the sun had reached its zenith, and heat exhaustion was claiming victims even without enemy action, the Crusader vanguard reached the outskirts of Arsuf, and Richard judged the moment had arrived. But before he could signal the trumpeters, the Hospitaller rearguard, pushed beyond endurance, broke formation without orders and charged. The chroniclers would later debate who exactly precipitated this unauthorized attack. Some claimed it was 2 knights, one named Baldwin Carew, and another whose name is lost, who simply could no longer endure being target practice for Saracen arrows and spurred their horses forward in defiance of Richard's commands. Others suggested that portions of the rear guard had not received clear orders to wait for the trumpet signal and assumed they had discretion to act. Still others hinted that Garnier of Nablus himself had tacitly authorized the charge, knowing that it violated Richard's strategy, but convinced that his men would die anyway if forced to continue absorbing punishment. Regardless of who initiated it, hundreds of Hospitaller knights suddenly surged forward, their destriers accelerating from walk to trot to canter to full gallop, the ground trembling under the impact of tons of armoured horseflesh and armoured men moving in a concentrated mass, lances lowering to the horizontal position from which they would deliver impacts capable of skewering 2 men with a single thrust. The sight of this unplanned charge could have triggered disaster, as Richard's carefully coordinated battle plan dissolved in the dust thrown up by Hospitaller horses. But the king demonstrated why he was considered the age's finest battlefield commander by instantly abandoning his original strategy and improvising a new one. Rather than attempting to recall the Hospitallers, which was impossible, or allowing them to charge alone into destruction, which was unconscionable, Richard immediately ordered all 6 trumpets to sound the general charge, transforming an unauthorized attack by a portion of his army into a coordinated offensive by his entire cavalry force. The response was not instantaneous, as different sections of the column were in varying states of readiness, and the trumpet signal took time to propagate and be recognized. But within minutes, the entire mass of Crusader heavy cavalry was in motion, nearly 2,000 armoured knights charging on a front that extended for over a mile, the largest concentration of Western European heavy cavalry, deployed in a single charge since Hastings more than a century earlier. The impact when this metal-sheathed hammer struck Saladin's forces was literally earth-shaking, the kind of collision that could be heard miles away as a sustained crash of metal on metal, wood on leather, horseflesh against human bodies. The Saracen cavalry, composed primarily of light horsemen whose tactics centered on mobility and missile fire, were simply incapable of standing against the kinetic energy of a full Crusader charge, their horses unable to match the weight and momentum of the Western destriers, their equipment unable to withstand lance impacts delivered by men whose entire military training focused on this single moment. The Frankish charge went through the forward elements of Saladin's army like a spear through silk, cavalry formations that had been loosing arrows scattering in all directions as knights in full armour crashed into their ranks, lances splintering as they penetrated bodies and were discarded to be replaced by swords that rose and fell with mechanical efficiency. The military orders led the charge with a disciplined fury that reflected years of training, their ranks maintaining cohesion even in the chaos of combat. But the secular knights fought with equal determination, their motivations ranging from genuine religious conviction to simple bloodlust to the knowledge that capture by Saracen forces often meant slavery or execution. The Muslim forces immediately in the path of the charge were destroyed in minutes, killed or scattered, their formations dissolving as men chose survival over glory. But Saladin's army was too large and too dispersed for a single charge to annihilate, and the Sultan's tactical skill now manifested in his rapid redeployment of forces to contain the Crusader breakthrough. The Mamluk regiments, those elite slave soldiers whose discipline matched that of the military orders, formed a new defensive line several hundred yards behind the initial contact point, and the Crusader charge, which had expended its initial momentum, now found itself facing fresh troops positioned to counterattack. This was the critical moment in the battle's development, the point at which many medieval cavalry charges, even successful ones, ended in disaster as victorious knights, scattered in pursuit and with exhausted horses, were countercharged by enemy reserves and destroyed in detail. Richard, however, had not committed his entire force to the initial charge. He had retained a strong cavalry reserve under his personal command, and he now deployed these fresh squadrons to support the initial attackers, while simultaneously ordering his infantry to advance and provide a solid base to which the cavalry could retire if necessary. The Crusader infantry, freed from the defensive posture they had maintained all morning, surged forward with the pent-up aggression of men who had endured hours of being unable to strike back, their crossbowmen firing methodically at any Saracen formation attempting to cohere, their spearmen finishing off wounded Muslim soldiers and securing the ground the cavalry had taken. The battle transformed from a mobile harassment into a general engagement across a front stretching from the coast to the eastern hills, with combat occurring simultaneously at dozens of separate points, each small action contributing to the larger pattern that would determine the day's outcome. Saladin attempted to salvage the situation by committing his own reserves, bringing up fresh cavalry from positions in the hills and ordering his subordinate emirs to concentrate their forces for a counterstroke against the Crusader left flank, which appeared vulnerable as it extended to maintain contact with the advancing centre. If the Sultan could achieve a breakthrough on the Crusader left, he might roll up Richard's line just as he had planned to roll up the Christian column earlier, and the mathematical advantage of his superior numbers would finally translate into tactical victory. The fighting intensified as Muslim forces, responding to Saladin's orders, converged on the Crusader left, where Norman and Angevin knights found themselves engaged in a swirling cavalry melee against Mamluks and Syrian heavy cavalry, the kind of close-quarters mounted combat at which both sides excelled. In these individual encounters, the outcome depended on horsemanship, weapon skill, equipment quality, and simple luck, with some knights falling in the first seconds of contact, while others seemed to lead charmed lives, cutting down opponent after opponent until their swords were notched and fouled with gore. Richard, observing the pressure on his left from his command position, personally led a charge to reinforce that sector, his presence transforming a defensive struggle into a renewed offensive as the morale boost from having the King of England fighting in their ranks gave the embattled Normans fresh energy. The chroniclers who recorded Richard's personal combat at Arsuf described feats that strained credibility, but which were attested by multiple independent sources. The king was said to have killed or unhorsed dozens of enemies personally, his great sword, a blade of exceptional quality probably produced in one of the renowned armories of Cologne or Paris, cutting through chainmail and even some plate components as if they were linen. He was reported to have saved wounded knights by interposing himself between them and pursuing Saracens, accepting attacks on his own armour to protect men who could no longer defend themselves, and witnesses swore that at one point his horse was killed under him, and he fought on foot until another mount could be brought up, an extraordinary vulnerability for a king to accept in the midst of enemy forces. Whether all these accounts were literally accurate or whether they reflect the tendency of medieval chroniclers to embellish their heroes' deeds, the undeniable fact is that Richard survived the battle unwounded despite exposing himself to danger that killed scores of men around him and his army achieved a decisive tactical victory that contemporary sources attributed largely to his personal leadership. The collapse of Saladin's left wing, rooted by the initial Crusader charge, had created a cascading failure in Muslim coordination, as units that had been positioned to support attacks suddenly found themselves threatened by enemies who should have been on the defensive, and as messengers carrying orders from Saladin's command post arrived at positions whose commanders had already retreated or been killed. By mid-afternoon, perhaps 2 or 3 hours after the unauthorized hospitaller charge had initiated the general engagement, Saracen resistance across most of the battlefield had dissolved from coordinated defence into individual groups fighting to disengage or simply fleeing toward the hills where Crusader heavy cavalry could not easily pursue. The slaughter during this pursuit phase was immense, as knights who had spent weeks enduring arrow fire without retaliation now chased down retreating Saracens and cut them down from behind, and as infantry who caught up to the pursuit finished off anyone who fell wounded or whose horse foundered. The figure sometimes cited for Saracen casualties at Arsuf is 7,000 dead, while other sources suggest 30,000, and still others admit they cannot provide reliable numbers. The 17-minute time frame mentioned in later popular accounts almost certainly refers to the duration of the initial cavalry charge's most intense phase, not the entire battle, which lasted several hours from first contact to final disengagement. What is clear from comparing multiple sources is that Saladin's army suffered catastrophic losses in killed, wounded, and captured, that its formations were scattered across miles of coastal plain and hill country, and that the Sultan's attempt to prevent the Crusader march to Jaffa had failed decisively. Richard, for his part, lost relatively few men considering the intensity of the combat. Estimates range from a few hundred to perhaps 1,000 casualties, including wounded, a remarkably low figure that testifies to the effectiveness of Crusader armour and tactics when properly employed. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw Richard making decisions that revealed both his strategic insight and the limitations he faced. He did not pursue Saladin's broken army into the hills, recognising that doing so would expose his cavalry to ambush and counterattack in terrain that favoured the Saracens, and that his primary objective was not annihilating Saladin's field army, but securing Jaffa as a base for future operations. The Crusader army spent the night on the battlefield, a traditional way of claiming victory, and the next morning continued its march south, reaching Jaffa without further significant resistance. The psychological impact of Arsuf reverberated throughout the Crusader states and the Muslim world. Not because the battle fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Saladin retained control of Jerusalem and most of the interior, while the Franks held the coast, but because it shattered the aura of invincibility that Saladin had acquired after Hattin, and demonstrated that Muslim forces could not prevent a determined and well-led Crusader army from operating in the theatre. For Richard, Arsuf represented the apex of his military career, the perfect synthesis of careful planning and opportunistic improvisation, of strategic patience and tactical aggression, and it secured his reputation as one of the great commanders of the medieval period. Yet the battle also illustrated the fundamental strategic dilemma facing the Crusaders. They could win battles but lack the resources to win the war, their army too small to garrison the interior cities they might capture, their logistics too fragile to support an extended siege of Jerusalem, their political unity too fractured to maintain a coherent long-term strategy. Within months, Richard would negotiate a treaty with Saladin that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, while securing Christian access to holy sites and control of the coastal strip, a compromise that satisfied neither side, but reflected the military stalemate that persisted despite Arsuf's tactical decisiveness. The King of England would depart the Holy Land in October of 1192, never to return, his subsequent capture by Leopold of Austria while travelling home, and his ransom by his brother John becoming the stuff of legend, while Saladin would die in Damascus in March of 1193. His empire immediately fragmenting among his quarrelling heirs, both men having fought each other to a standstill in mutual respect. The battlefield at Arsuf returned to its pre-war obscurity, a stretch of coastal plain where farmers would plough up rusty weapons and skeletal remains for centuries afterward. Physical evidence of that September day when the mathematics of medieval warfare, the calculations of momentum and morale, armour and arrows, discipline and desperation, had been worked out in blood and iron, producing a result that contemporaries recognised as militarily significant, even if its strategic consequences proved limited. The details of the battle were recorded by chroniclers on both sides, though with predictable differences in emphasis and interpretation. The Christian sources stressed Richard's leadership and the righteousness of the Crusader cause, while Muslim accounts emphasise Saladin's skill in extricating most of his army from a difficult situation and maintaining the jihad despite a temporary setback. Modern historians, comparing these sources and attempting to reconstruct what actually occurred, generally agree that Arsuf was a clear Crusader tactical victory achieved through superior heavy cavalry employed at the decisive moment, but they also note that the battle's long-term impact was limited by the underlying strategic realities of Crusader presence in the Levant. What none of the sources dispute is that on that first day of September in 1191, along a dusty coastal road in a land far from the green hills and grey castles of Western Europe, Richard Plantagenet commanded an army that turned near disaster into triumphant victory through a combination of discipline, timing, and the tremendous shock power of massed heavy cavalry, creating one of the medieval period's most studied military engagements and securing a place in the historical record that would be analysed and debated by military theorists for the next 8 centuries.